In the year 1471, a single campaign would redraw the map of Southeast Asia. It was not just a battle, it was a decisive moment when the kingdom of Dai Viet surged southward under the command of Emperor Tong, and the ancient kingdom of Champa fell into ruin. For centuries, two kingdoms stood side by side, locked in an endless struggle over land, power, and survival. To the north was Dai Viet, the rising nation born from the fertile Red River Delta, a people hardened by generations of war against Chinese empires. To the south lay Champa, an ancient maritime kingdom shaped by Indianized culture, Hindu temples, and the wealth of ocean trade. The line between them was never fixed. Sometimes it ran across rice fields, sometimes across mountain ridges, and often along the sandy, windswept shores of what is today central Vietnam. But wherever that border lay, it was always drenched in blood. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Dai Viet kings pushed southward, eager to secure more farmland for their people. Champa struck back with swift cavalry raids, burning villages and carrying thousands into slavery. This cycle of violence forged a rivalry unlike any other in Southeast Asia. Unlike the distant Chinese dynasties, who came in vast waves of conquest, the Cham were neighbors, dangerous, unpredictable, and relentless. By the 14th century, the struggle had grown even more brutal. Champa, weakened by internal conflicts, turned to piracy. From their ports, Cham ships raided the Vietnamese coast, capturing fishermen, plundering villages, and demanding tribute. Vietnamese chronicles describe entire coastal communities emptied overnight, men slaughtered, women and children taken away. For the people of Dai Viet, this was not just politics, it was survival. In 1446, a Vietnamese army marched deep into Champa and briefly captured Vijaya, the Cham capital located in what is today Binh Dinh province of central Vietnam. But the victory was short-lived. The Vietnamese withdrew, leaving behind resentment and unfinished business. Champa rebuilt and the border war resumed. By the mid-15th century, Tong, emperor of Dai Viet, ascended the throne. He was a scholar, a reformer, but above all, a ruler with a vision. He saw the southern kingdom not as a neighbor, but as a threat to be erased. He understood that Dai Viet could never be secure as long as Champa survived. For centuries, the Vietnamese had fought to hold their land. Now, under his command, they would fight to expand it. The year was 1471. The moment had come. The winter of 1470 was harsh in the Red River Delta, homeland of Dai Viet. Cold winds swept across the villages, but inside the imperial court of Thang Long, the city that would one day be known as Hanoi, Emperor Tong prepared for war. He had already reformed his military with strict discipline, clear ranks, and laws that punished corruption and cowardice. Now he would put his new system to the ultimate test. Reports told him that Tuan, king of Champa, had sent raiding parties north, burning Vietnamese border villages. This gave Tong his justification. He declared that Dai Viet would no longer tolerate such insults. The time had come for final reckoning. In January 1471, the emperor gave the order to march. Soldiers from every province gathered. The force that assembled was immense. Vietnamese records speak of more than 100,000 men. Lines of infantry carried spears, swords, and crossbows. Cavalry rode sturdy Vietnamese horses. Most terrifying of all were the war elephants, massive beasts armored with iron, carrying towers of archers on their backs. The march began from Thanh Hoa province, moving south through rugged mountains and valleys. Supply caravans followed, ox carts loaded with rice, salt, and weapons. Engineers carried bamboo and timber to build bridges. Every detail had been planned. Tong knew that wars were won not only by swords but by logistics. Near the Thu Bon River, in present-day Quang Nam province, the Vietnamese encountered the first Cham defenses. Cham scouts attacked with hit-and-run tactics, loosing arrows from horseback before retreating into the jungle. But Tong anticipated this. He deployed light infantry in ambush positions along the trails. Several Cham detachments rode straight into traps and were annihilated. Captured Cham officers were interrogated, revealing vital intelligence about enemy positions. The emperor forbade unnecessary cruelty against civilians, yet villages that resisted were destroyed to deny supplies to the enemy. Step by step, the Vietnamese army tightened its grip on the Cham heartland. By February, the army entered the core territory of Champa. Fear spread like wildfire. Farmers abandoned their fields. Cham garrisons retreated to strongholds. Tong then divided his army into three wings. The main force, led by himself, advanced directly toward Vijaya. A second wing marched along the coast to block Cham reinforcements arriving by sea. The third wing pushed through the highlands, sealing off the kingdom from the west. It was a masterstroke of coordination, designed to suffocate Champa completely. At every step, discipline was enforced. Looting was forbidden. Supply lines were heavily guarded. Scouts reported daily. The Cham, who once relied on speed and ambush, now found themselves hunted, overwhelmed by superior numbers and strategy. The Vietnamese advance was unstoppable, and with each passing day, Vijaya, the heart of Champa, drew closer. By early March of 1471, the Vietnamese army had reached the walls of Vijaya. The Cham capital rose out of the plains, its walls of stone and earth standing tall, flanked by watchtowers. Behind those defenses gathered the last hope of the Cham Kingdom. Warriors, nobles, and desperate peasants pressed into service. Inside the palace, King Tra Toan urged his generals to resist, to hold the walls until relief might come from the sea. But Tong had no intention of allowing relief. His coastal wing had already cut off Cham reinforcements arriving by ship. The Highland wing closed the western passes. Vijaya was surrounded. The trap was complete. The emperor inspected the walls personally. He was no distant commander. He walked among his soldiers, speaking to officers, studying the fortifications, and listening to scouts. He saw the strength of Vijaya, high ramparts, narrow gates, and deep ditches. But he also saw its weakness, a population already exhausted by famine and raids. The Cham defenders were brave, but they were outnumbered nearly 10-1. Tong devised a careful strategy. He would not waste lives in reckless charges. Instead, he ordered siege lines constructed all around the city. Towers of wood were built, higher than the Cham walls, allowing Vietnamese archers to rain arrows down into the city. Catapults hurled stones and fire, breaking houses and burning storehouses. Engineers filled the ditches with earth and logs, preparing the ground for a final assault. For days, thunderous war drums echoed across the plain. Vietnamese soldiers rotated in shifts, launching continuous attacks to wear down the defenders. Cham counterattacks were fierce. Warriors rushed out of the gates, wielding curved sabers, their cavalry charging in desperate sally attempts. Several times they struck hard, but each time the disciplined Vietnamese lines closed ranks, elephants driving the Cham back behind their walls. The Cham tried to use fire to destroy the siege towers, sending burning carts rolling toward the Vietnamese lines. But Tong had anticipated this. Water buckets and trenches were ready, and most of the fires were quickly smothered. Inside Vijaya, despair grew. Food was running short. Refugees clogged the streets. Disease spread in the crowded quarters. King Tra Toan appealed to his gods, praying at the great Hindu temples of the city, but no miracle came. The emperor, calm and methodical, waited. He knew time itself was his ally, yet he also understood the need for a decisive blow. After 2 weeks of constant siege, he gave the order. On the morning of the final assault, horns blared and drums shook the earth. The Vietnamese surged forward in 3 massive waves. The first wave stormed the eastern gate, carrying heavy shields and battering rams. Arrows darkened the sky, but the rams struck, cracking the wooden gates. The second wave pressed toward the southern wall, ladders rising against the stone. Elephants charged, smashing barricades, while archers rained fire arrows into the city. The third wave circled from the west, striking where the walls had already been weakened by days of bombardment. The fighting was brutal. Vietnamese soldiers climbed over corpses to scale the walls. Cham warriors fought with desperate fury, hurling spears, pouring boiling oil, striking from above. But the tide could not be stopped. One by one, the gates gave way. Siege towers rolled against the walls, releasing streams of infantry into the city. By midday, flames rose over Vijaya. The streets became rivers of chaos, soldiers clashing in alleys, houses burning, elephants crashing through wooden barricades. The defenders fought to the last, but the weight of numbers was overwhelming. Finally, the palace itself fell. Vietnamese troops stormed through its gates. King Tra Toan was captured alive, dragged from his throne in chains. His nobles were cut down or taken prisoner. Vijaya, the proud capital of Champa, was no more. For Lê Thanh Tong, the victory was complete. For Champa, it was the end of an age. When the walls of Vijaya finally collapsed, the city became a storm of blood and fire. Vietnamese soldiers poured through the streets, cutting down any Cham warrior who still resisted. The cries of battle mixed with the roar of burning houses, the thunder of elephants trampling wooden barricades, and the desperate screams of civilians caught in the chaos. The chronicles of Dai Viet record that more than 60,000 Cham were killed in the storming of the city. Another 30,000 were captured alive. Men, women, and children forced into captivity and marched north as prisoners of war. These numbers, staggering even by the brutal standards of the 15th century, marked the end of a nation. King Tra Toan, once the ruler of Champa, was bound in chains. He had hoped to die in battle, but fate denied him even that. Alongside him, many nobles of Champa were taken prisoner. Some were executed immediately as a warning. Others were sent back to Dai Viet to live out their days in humiliation, stripped of rank and power. Lê Thanh Tong entered the fallen capital. He walked through Vijaya not as a looter, but as a conqueror who sought order. He gave strict orders to his troops: seize the city, but do not descend into madness. Yet even with discipline enforced, the sheer size of the slaughter was overwhelming. Entire districts of Vijaya were reduced to ash. Temples that had stood for centuries, Hindu shrines decorated with carvings of gods and warriors, were toppled, looted, or burned. The great palace of Champa, once a seat of kings, was shattered, its treasures carried north as symbols of victory. For the Cham people, the fall of Vijaya was more than a military defeat. It was cultural annihilation. Their capital, their heart, their identity as an independent kingdom had been erased in a matter of weeks. Refugees scattered into the mountains, some fleeing to the south, others hiding in remote villages. But they would never again gather the strength to rebuild a kingdom. Lê Thanh Tong proclaimed the victory not as conquest alone, but as justice. He declared that Dai Viet had ended centuries of raids, piracy, and insult from Champa. The southern kingdom, once a rival power, was no more. Its lands would now belong to Dai Viet, its people scattered, its throne broken. The massacre of Vijaya sent shockwaves across Southeast Asia. Neighboring kingdoms heard the news with awe and fear. For centuries, Champa had been a thorn in the side of both Vietnam and Cambodia. Now, in a single campaign, it was destroyed. The map of the region had been redrawn. When the smoke of Vijaya finally cleared, Emperor Lê Thanh Tong turned from warrior to ruler. His victory had destroyed Champa's political and military power, but now came the task of reshaping the conquered land into something lasting. He issued orders to reorganize the territory. The once proud capital and its surrounding lands were annexed directly into Dai Viet. Governors loyal to the emperor were installed, and new administrative districts were created. Where Cham kings once ruled, Vietnamese officials now enforced imperial law. Lê Thanh Tong did not leave the conquered land empty. He understood that control required settlement. Thousands of Vietnamese families were encouraged, sometimes ordered, to move south into the fertile plains of Binh Dinh and Quang Nam. These settlers built villages, tilled the rice fields, and established temples dedicated to Vietnamese ancestors. Slowly, the Cham homeland was transformed, its culture layered over by the traditions of Dai Viet. For the Cham people who survived, life became one of survival under foreign rule. Some accepted the new order, paying taxes and living as subjects of the emperor. Others fled further south, to the coastal lands that would later become Ninh Thuan and Binh Thuan. These southern remnants would preserve Cham culture for centuries, but never again as an independent kingdom. Le Thanh Tong declared that the conquest was not mere expansion, but destiny. For generations, the Vietnamese had been hemmed in between China to the north and Champa to the south. Now the southern threat was gone, and Dai Viet's frontier stretched deep into central Vietnam. It was a turning point, the beginning of a great southward movement known in history as Nam Tien, the Vietnamese expansion to the south. The emperor marked his triumph with ceremonies in Thang Long. Envoys from neighboring kingdoms, Lan Sang in Laos, Ayutthaya in Siam, even envoys from Ming China, watched carefully. They saw that Dai Viet had become not only a survivor, but a power in its own right. Champa, once the maritime rival of Vietnam, India, and Cambodia, was shattered. Its capital reduced to ashes, its king in chains, its people dispersed. What remained of its culture would survive only in scattered temples, in small coastal enclaves, and in memory. Le Thanh Tong's campaign had not just destroyed a kingdom, it had changed the balance of power in Southeast Asia forever. The year 1471 marked the end of one kingdom and the rise of another. For Dai Viet, it was the crowning achievement of Emperor Le Thanh Tong's reign. For Champa, it was a catastrophe from which they would never recover. In the decades that followed, Dai Viet expanded steadily southward. The fertile lands of Binh Dinh and Quang Nam became heartlands of Vietnamese settlement. Slowly, Vietnamese villages spread further, down the long spine of central Vietnam, until the Cham people were pushed into smaller enclaves along the southern coast. The Cham who remained lived as survivors of a broken kingdom. They clung to their culture, building brick towers, preserving their Hindu traditions, singing songs of a lost homeland. Even today in the villages of Ninh Thuan and Binh Thuan, the descendants of Champa remember their history, but they remember it as a story of loss, not sovereignty. For Dai Viet, the campaign of 1471 became a symbol of strength, discipline, and unity. Le Thanh Tong was remembered not only as a conqueror, but as a reformer who gave his nation new laws, new order, and new confidence. His victory was seen as proof that Vietnam could not only defend itself against invaders, but could shape its destiny on its own terms. Historians view the fall of Champa as one of the great turning points in Southeast Asia. A maritime kingdom that once traded with India, China, and even distant Arabia was erased. In its place, a stronger, larger Vietnam emerged, destined to play a central role in the region's future. But victory came at a cost. The fields of Binh Dinh were soaked with blood. Tens of thousands had perished. A civilization was broken. And even as Dai Viet celebrated, the ghosts of Vijaya lingered in ruined temples, in scattered refugees, in the memory of a people who once stood proud. Centuries later, the story of 1471 still echoes. For the Vietnamese, it is remembered as the moment when the nation turned south and never looked back. For the Cham, it is remembered as tragedy. And for the world, it remains a lesson that kingdoms rise and fall, but memory endures.